Welcome back to the Grand Solar Minimum channel, guys. Good evening. Tonight we have a special guest, actually an individual that we met via our Facebook group and, of course, our call-in show on Patreon. And I just wanted to give a brief intro, Jess, real quick. Jesse, thank you very much for joining us tonight on the Grand Solar Minimum channel.
Well, you're welcome. Happy to be here tonight.
So, this channel has been on YouTube for 3 years, and we've done a lot of science explanations. We've talked about the weather, the climate, and here recently this year, we started noticing more, like last year it was a little bit more crop loss talk than previous years, but this year we are definitely hearing about a lot more crop loss across the United States. We all know that we had about 3 to 5 weeks. Some farmers were 3 to 5 weeks behind on planting. And just the other night, we did a broadcast talking about the grow season is over. And some commenter said, well, yeah, it's the grow season ends around this time of year. They're like, okay, fair enough. But when the grow season ends now and the planting was 3 to 5 weeks behind, that's a problem. So, here lately on the Patreon channel, we've been trying to talk more about prepping and just strategic thinking to how to deal with the challenges of the Grand Solar Minimum. And tonight we brought Jesse on to kind of talk to us about some tips on growing, lots of great ideas. We've talked to this guy a couple times on our Patreon show, and it always feels like we could probably go on for hours, but tonight we bring him from you all the way from Wisconsin. Jesse, if you want, just go ahead and give a little bit of background about yourself real quick.
Sure. My name is Jesse. I'm from northwestern Wisconsin. I grew up on a dairy farm, went to college, got an undergrad degree in food science, got my master's in horticulture, ended up coming back to the family farm and helping out after an illness in the family, and been involved growing garden on my own since the age of 13. And I actually have a grandmother that started farmers markets in 2 major communities in the area, and I have 2 aunts that do farmers market. So there's a lot of gardening in my background, and I did farmers market for a number of years myself. So I basically really enjoy plants, and I can go and open a book and read about plants for hours and go and spend hours out in the garden. So it's kind of a nice thing that I'm interested in, and I love to share about it.
Well, if things happen the way that some are predicting, guys like you, like our friend Matt in Nebraska, and guys like you are going to be looked upon as almost like elite gods, because you do have a very good wealth of knowledge on growing. And tonight, like I said, we've always talked about it's about time we start growing our own produce and food. But tonight, I'd just like to talk to our viewers and just kind of give them some insights and tips and, what's favorable, what kind of, earlier before we went on the air, we were talking about weeds that we could actually use as food as well. So that kind of stuff intrigues me, and we can share that. Anything will be useful in that case.
Yeah, something I've always been fascinated with was the weeds in the garden, and some of the weeds, it's like, wow, is that actually a grain crop? Like looking at a giant foxtail grass, and it's like, gosh, it looks like a grain. It almost looks like it was selected to be that large, because you have like the green foxtail and the purple foxtail, and then you have this giant foxtail grass. It looked like it was a selected species. And later to find out, okay, there is like an Italian millet that's selected from the green foxtail, and there's all these other weeds out there that are either grain crops or vegetable crops or have other edible roots that just come back year after year in the garden. I like calling those like cryptic grains or cryptic vegetables, because you're going to be growing your garden, and the things you think are weeds are, for the most part, vegetables or could be eaten. So even if you lost your entire seed supply, you could go and turn over the soil in your garden, and you have the potential of all these different food crops that are already in the soil. And you have some garden vegetables that will come back year after year from seed once you have them. It's hard to get rid of them. You plant dill. You're always going to have dill in your garden. You plant tomatillos. You're going to have tomatillos every year in your garden. Ground cherries, the same thing. So kind of thinking of building up a garden where you'll have the soil itself is a seed bank that you can always tap in case of an emergency for a garden. And I'm also working on, this year I grew 100 linear feet of amaranth. And I enjoy cooking up the seeds like a porridge, kind of like a wheat farina. And you can also sprout them or grow them up as a baby green or a microgreen. And it takes 1 pound and you can seed an entire acre. So I did the 1 row and I want to see how much it spreads through the garden next year. Because the variety I picked is a bright red plant and it's going to stick out like a sore thumb. So I'm just kind of curious to see how, this is my first year with this new garden, and moved last year, only did gardens in pots the year before, and I want to see how this garden takes off this year or next year.
I'm curious what you just mentioned. You talked about how you would make a porridge and whatnot. Is there like a recommended website that gives recipes for these types of weeds that you're talking about that you could actually have growing as well in your garden? Is there a reference point for that, or is?
Well, there's a lot of different wild plant and edible places. Actually, one of my favorites is I like this book, The Field Guide to North American Edible Wild Plants, and there's been numerous editions of that, and they have with each plant a way of cooking or preparing it. And you think about amaranth, there's also the wild amaranths, which are your pigweeds, and they have seeds that you can harvest and cook as well. And they also have edible leaves. And then there's your chenopodiums, like your lamb's quarter. And when I'm thinning my beets, I will pick the lamb's quarter with the little beetlets that I'm thinning, and I will eat the lamb's quarter with the beet greens because they're both chenopodiums and they cook up and they taste really nice together. And lamb's quarter, the chenopodium, another interesting chenopodium I want to experiment with next year will be trying to grow quinoa and see if I can grow that. The quinoa seed looks awful similar to the amaranth seed, but the amaranth I would say is about a tenth the volume or smaller than the quinoa seed.
See,
and they both cook by boiling.
I like the quinoa. I could get down with that. It almost has, if I'm not mistaken, that's almost like a rice texture almost, right? Is that what I'm thinking of? Yeah, I could.
Yeah.
That is pretty good. I've actually eaten that before, and
I got him hooked on it.
yeah,
love quinoa.
Mari actually did. But we spice it up a little bit, throw some sour cream and other things, and to kind of make
You
it
can make like
salsa,
Southwestern rice.
like a Southwestern
I use
style.
it like rice.
Exactly.
Awesome. Yum.
So very interesting. Yeah, I think it's important too that not only, and we talked about this a long time ago with Ice Age Farmer, and one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to him back then was he does a lot of aquaponics. And we kind of went over the thing that fascinated me about what we're talking about growing, things like moringa, things that go along with your normal food to give you the nutrients. And it sounds like, to me, like this is like a 2-in-1 type deal if your garden grows weeds that you could actually consume. So your efforts of pulling these weeds are rewarded at the same time. Just to me, it sounds efficient. And that's something I never really thought of before. So that's pretty cool.
Well, and think about crabgrass, digitera. Now, that was brought over by the Polish people, and the seeds of it are a grain. And it's in this big family of grain plants. Let me get made a note of that. Because not in college, I don't need to have everything memorized anymore.
No kidding.
See. Yeah. Oh, just remembering so it's a poaceae, it's a grass, and it's in the tribe Aragrosstidae, which has Erogosissus teff, which teff is one of the millets that are in this family, and teff is like the grain that's grown in. My mind just blanked on the oldest Christian kingdom in the world. It's in Africa. It's right next to Somalia, Ethiopia. Like the bread of Ethiopia is made from teff. Then the Panicum milliense, which is proso millet, which is the common millet or broomcorn that's grown throughout the U.S. Then there's within the same tribe there is the Pensicium glaxinium, which is your pearl millet, which you'll find in your bird seed, and that can be cooked up and eaten very similar to rice. Then this giant foxtail I'm talking about is within there, which is the Sedentaria. Let's see. Well, Sedentaria italica is the foxtail millet, and then the giant millet is the Sedentaria. So I'm going to be using the genus and species names because you're always at risk using common names for multiple things. Sedentaria faberi. So we are just going to try to avoid having any misunderstandings with plants by I'm going to use a common name. I'll try to mention a genus and species when I'm talking about these weedy plants, because we don't want to have any confusions or risk with people.
Sure.
And Digitaria, the crabgrass is in there. And the thing about crabgrass, it was USDA was interested back before it got big into soy and such, because it's a very nutrient-dense plant. And you think about doing wheatgrass, you can actually do crabgrass juice the same way you do wheatgrass, and as a nutrient-dense green juice. And then you can eat the seeds as grain.
Now, you say that you're experimenting with, I'm just curious, how big of a garden do you have for yourself?
Okay, my garden this year was 200 feet by 200 feet. And then I had about 30 pots that I had plants in.
And what was your inventory as far as what you're growing in your garden? I mean, you don't have to give me list by list, but just kind of give us an idea of the kind of stuff. Because you live in what is it, northern Wisconsin, or what's your actual location in like northern part of the state?
Yeah, northwestern Wisconsin, zone 4. So we get cold. We get a pretty deep cold in the winter, so some stuff doesn't overwinter as much. Kind of in this whole idea of taking advantage of the resources around you is, for me, with the vegetables I grow, for a lot of stuff where you're buying like flats or pre-started seedling plants or bedding plants, I contract with local greenhouses to grow that. And a lot of farmers market people, they contract with the local greenhouses to start seeds to grow flats of vegetables for them to transplant. So you don't need to have a greenhouse or any fancy stuff to have a large amount of high quality seedlings to start your gardens with. So this last growing season, I had 17 flats of vegetables grown. Now flats are sometimes called plug trays, and they're about 10 inches by 20 inches. And they have different counts of seedlings in there. So you can have one that's a 50 count, so it would be 5 by 10 of seedlings, or a 72 count, a 98 count, or a 128 count, or a 200 count. And most of the plug trays I get are 72 count and 128 count. And so I did 17 flats of that. I got 256 cabbage plants that I put in. I put in just around 150 tomato plants. I put in 120 celery plants. I put in I put in about 100 or 250 pepper plants. And then I bought did about 98 thyme plants and basils. Did about the same. Did 120 little started leeks. I did fennel. Uh, and then I did 128 plants of broccoli, and I did 128 plants of Brussels sprouts.
So I'm looking at the chat. A couple things. I'll get to the crabgrass juice here in a minute, but Cheryl wants to know, what do you do with that much cabbage, Jesse? And that's interesting because Mari was actually just saying that that's a lot of plants. And you mentioned lentil as well.
Oh no, I did leeks.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
I have yet to try growing lentils. And they grow them in Canada, so I definitely assume I'll be able to grow them, but I have yet to do those.
Well, the lentils, and I'd say I just recently had lentil soup, and the gentleman that made it was actually the same boss I was talking about working for his car lot, actually. It's kind of weird. I have to mention him a second time tonight, but he is from Lebanon, and he has this recipe for lentil. And I'm not usually, especially back then, this is like 5 years ago. I'm not a soup guy. I'm not a fresh veggies guy. I've never, been that way, but I'm starting to learn that thanks to Mari. But he brought in some.
He's awful. Don't believe him.
I eat more vegetables
Fake
than I
news,
ever
dude.
did.
Fake news.
Before, it was nothing but McDonald's
You don't
and
eat
Domino's.
vegetables.
Now, I had chicken noodle soup with peas and
Such
corn in it and
liar.
carrots tonight. Oh my God, you are fired. So, you threw me off. Don't do that again. I don't even know what I was saying now.
Lentil soup,
Thank
Jake.
you. Oh, lentil soup, yes. Damn you, woman. Anyway, so lentil soup, delicious. I was so shocked that I actually finished it to the point where I drank the broth out of the bowl. I handed back my boss an empty bowl, and he just grinned at me. He's like, "That was good, wasn't it?" I was like, "Absolutely." So some of this stuff that you're talking about and what you're growing, to some folks it doesn't sound that exciting, but if you know how to cook, I guess that would be the cure to some of the blander vegetables, because I'm just not a fan of veggies. I mean,
You're the worst eater
I'm
I've
getting
ever
better.
witnessed in my whole entire life.
I'm getting better though.
Awful.
No, I understand that. I mean, I've had roommates at college that weren't vegetable eaters, or it's like, I hate squash. And then I made squash soup for them. So I made this chipotle apple squash soup. And
Now that sounds
the guy
good.
was like, that. Yeah. It was awesome. I actually went and visited a flavor company called Quest International when I was undergrad, and I ended up. So it's a flavor house. They basically make flavors for different food products to match the flavors that you would find from other competitors. It's like you would need these ingredients, and they had this lobster pumpkin bisque soup, and I totally ripped it off and made my own version of it with sans lobster, because how often can you afford lobster? But
True. So I saw a comment here. We were talking about crabgrass juice. One gentleman suggested that you mix it with some cockroach milk, and that tastes great. That might be just a New Mexico thing. I don't know. I've never heard of that.
well, if you never know how many insects you get in when you're grinding up the plants, so it's a little extra protein.
Yeah, that was Richard. But you're right. And we've seen so many new articles here and there kind of talk about how insects are the new beef or whatever in the future. And the idea of it is gross. But I'm seeing more studies unfortunately, about cockroach milk, how it could replace certain other things that have nutrients. I guess have you ever heard of this, or is this just fake news that you hear on the internet? I mean, that's a little extreme.
I've heard it mentioned, but the concept of grinding up insects and steeping them for a beverage seems kind of reasonable. I mean, people drink tequila, and they like putting that worm in the tequila. And there is actually a cheese that's grown or raised in Italy where they have fly maggots in it. It's an illegal cheese, but people buy this black market cheese that has living fly maggots in it in Italy.
Okay, yeah, that's where I would draw the line. Of course, I'd have to.
When the cheese jumps out and hits you in the nose, then you really realize something's going on with it.
I mean, the sad case is that people like me better buck up real quick, because if we ever have this major shift that some are expecting as it gets deeper into 2028, 2020, 30, I mean, it's either survive or not survive at that point. But let's get back to the garden talk. Get a little off talk. I was looking at the chat and I thought it was kind of funny.
The chat is on the edge of their seats about this cabbage.
What are they? They are really talking like, what is... Okay, Jesse, I'm sorry. What is going on with all the cabbage?
Okay, so I may be a little bit of German extraction, and I do make sauerkraut. So I'll make 50 or more pounds of sauerkraut in a year. And sauerkraut's really easy to make. So it's 50 pounds of cabbage to 1 pound of salt. You shred it, you get about an inch layer, you sprinkle some of the salt on it, you pack it down with your fist, and you keep layering cabbage and salt and packing it down with your fist. And as you go, the salt dissolving in the cabbage will chill the product, because it's an endothermic reaction as it dissolves, so it's drawing heat in, so it's chilling. And basically then you have this native fermentation that's going to go on in the pot, with all the lactic acid bacteria breaking down the sugars in the cabbage. So I've been making cabbage or sauerkraut with the family since I was a child, and I'm kind of the kraut cutter. So if we make sauerkraut, I go in my grandmother's basement and I take out the old maple kraut board, and we got the old crocks, and I cut the cabbage and I pack it down. And my brother is doing keto diet, so I will make sauerkraut, and then we let it ferment for 6 weeks, sometimes longer, and then we'll can it. Actually, that's kind of the interesting when you have a lot of vegetables. So it's like, well, we did sauerkraut. I have sauerkraut that's 6 years old that, I can still eat that sauerkraut. I even, from that year, I have canned tomatoes that are 6 years old, and I'm eating 6-year-old canned tomato sauce. Because you got some years that are very, very bountiful, you can a lot, and then you have an ability to use that. Now, with the cabbages, I also like making coleslaw, and then I'll make a green coleslaw where I do it all with green vegetables, and I'll do it with cilantro and jalapenos and celery in the coleslaw. So that's a pretty neat. Do a vinegar coleslaw, and then I'll make fried rice with the cabbage. So you just shred the cabbage and you saute that in a pan with oil, garlic, onions, shredded carrot or carrot if you like, and then throw the soy sauce in, and then I dump that off into another pan. Do a big scrambled egg omelet. Set that to the side. Then I get the rice in, fry it, and I add everything back in. And sometimes whatever meat you have or other stuff, throw it in. So I've been eating a lot of cabbage as fried rice, or I'll make yakisoba. So it's like just Japanese sweet fried noodles with cabbage. So shred the cabbage.
Mari likes the sound of that.
I am like such a big cabbage fan. I like using cabbage leaves for tacos, like without the carbs.
I don't know what it is. Like, I like sauerkraut, and but
you're just to us when it comes to food.
So here's what happened. Like, I was 19 years old, and I was trying to get into the Air Force, and I had to weigh 199 pounds to get in, and I was at 236, almost 240 pounds. So this Air Force recruiter was very aggressive about my diet, and first we ate nothing but tuna for a week, and then like the following week he put me on a cabbage soup diet. And I think the way it was prepared, probably, like, by the time I was done with that cabbage soup diet, I did it probably too long, like 2 weeks too long.
That's the worst diet ever.
Man, it's been rough to like look at cabbage and say, I can't wait to consume you.
You know what it was with the zucchini noodles I made you that one time? He just like...
Listen.
Now he has...
I'm not hating. I'm pointing out that if you're like me, we better change this attitude somehow. We better find a way, because like some of the things that you're talking about that you're growing, I actually do know what it is, and that does sound delicious. But I don't know. I guess I am picky with the veggies. I eat broccoli. I eat cauliflower.
Only if it's bathed in cheese.
Pickles. I like pickles as long as it's bathed in burger and cheese and mac sauce. No, but I mean, since I've met Mari, since I've been with her, I eat more vegetables than I ever in my life.
Lies.
And she's just mad because I count cake as a vegetable because there's wheat in the cake. So wheat is a form of.
Eating
I'm just
French
kidding.
fries all the time does not count.
It's a potato.
Either. Yeah.
It's a potato.
Or you just go trick them by making black bean brownies. Where you use the black beans to make brownies. I've had some friends that are nutritionists that have pulled that one on people.
Mushroom burger, because I think if I could season it right.
No.
Yeah,
Listen, we'll have to get with Rachel and Carl, and there is a certain mushroom that if you deep fry it, it tastes like bacon. I will go for that as long as I have some ranch on the side to dip it in, like a bacon and ranch type thing. That would be good. But don't be putting no mushrooms on my burgers. I swear. Not yet, please.
Well, hey, at least with the burgers, if there's ever a major disruption in food, there will be cows around. Because cows you can raise inside, and then you can feed them on any cellulose source. Even in my area, there's large poultry operations. And they've done research where they can substitute 10% of the grain with poultry bedding, and the cows are able to take the wood chip and the poultry droppings and actually use the urea in the droppings and then use that as a nitrogen source for protein because they got the gut bacteria that they actually feed on. So there's going to be beef around no matter what. So you will have a burger, but getting all the other stuff might be difficult.
Well, and I was going to ask you, what do you think about, like, the other night I was watching some TV and this one commercial comes on of a girl who is selling plant burgers from a food truck. And then the next commercial was where Burger King is pushing this new Impossible Whopper. So, like, out of nowhere here recently, we're starting to see more advertising for these plant burgers. But I guess my question is, I don't know much about how they make those. Is that stuff that we depend on from growth outdoor, or is that indoor growth? What is the difference when we're talking about things like plant burgers versus, regular meat?
Well, that's going to be the interesting thing because plant burgers basically depend on having good full growing seasons to produce the grain crops from which they're produced. And a lot of these fake meat burgers are made from peas because very few people have allergies to the proteins in peas. So they're made from pea protein and pea protein isolates. So the peas are dried and much the same way they do whey protein. They they make a liquid slurry, and then they use spray drying towers, and then they get these dry protein isolates. My hometown actually has a facility for making pea protein isolate. So, and a lot of that is grown down in Iowa, and it's kind of an answer to soy protein isolate because that was one of the main protein isolates that was raised. So you got soy protein, you got whey protein, and now you have pea protein isolate. And pea protein isolate avoids a lot of the allergen issues that you would have either with a whey protein or with a soy protein. And the Beyond Burger, Beyond Meat people have picked that up as a good base protein for these, or the Impossible Burgers for that. But that basically relies on the peas to be grown. And I think a lot of them are grown organically, but so,
well, and my point is that, if we're supposedly, let's just pretend for a minute that cows farting is affecting the climate, and we say, well, let's go ahead and switch all of our beef products to these plant burgers. And it's interesting you bring up peas, and I know this year we saw a shortage of peas in supermarkets across the United States for a brief period of time. We have stocked shelves now, but what's the point of taking away, let's say, the beef industry and when we can't even grow our crops a full season right now? I mean, to me, it sounds like a dangerous combination and an unnecessary switch. And I'm worried that, like with the Burger King and this other company, and like you mentioned, Beyond Meat, which there's a lot of people who stand to make billions of dollars from this movement. And again, it's policies like the Green New Deal that help strengthen and line the pockets of these people who invest in this plant. But again, the bottom line, if we can't get a full grow season, and let's hypothetically say we've cut back on raising cattle, I mean, what's easier, growing crops for cattle feed or growing crops to replace beef and our already normal demand?
Oh, definitely growing crops for cattle feed, because you can grow grasses and legumes on marshland ground that you don't even worry about them going to full maturity. And you just harvest them when before the seed has matured. So you're maximizing the amount of sugar in there. So basically you're trying to as much sugar out of the plants as possible, and protein as well. But sugar is the main thing because you're just really forcing the calories. So grasses are a great source of sugar, and they are even bred for cattle to have higher amounts of sugar. And you'll have dry periods in the summer where you can harvest that. Or you do the silages, and you don't need, it can be not as dry when it's baled or chopped and put into silage. So the cows are capable of eating anything. You can literally feed cows in India, they eat cardboard and paper, and the cows survive on the trash on the streets. So cows are amazing creatures. They're bioreactors on 4 legs. So, but trying to get plants to a right maturity so they don't mold in the field or mold in storage. So like this year, if your peas are wet, there's actually a technique which is called chemical drying, and it's put out there where you use like a glycosinolate, a glycophosphate to basically kill the plants, and then they all dry down within 3 days. And it's kind of put out there as a late season control of invasive weeds, but it's a way of having all your non-GMO crops dying and drying in a short period of time. So during wetter years, you might find more uses of chemical drying in the fields pre-harvest. And then plants that aren't fully dried down, they'll be taken to the mills, and then they'll be dried using propane. So propane is used by a lot of farmers or granaries to dry down the grains, so they're brought down to a moisture which is storable in the grain bins. Especially if you're doing stuff for human food production, you want no mold growth, because any sign of mold growth, that whole crop or that whole truck or grain bin will be rejected. And that's the biggest thing. And some of that stuff actually goes to make ethanol. So you'll have corn that has mold. Well, it gets shuttled off to make ethanol. But then they'll have distillers' grains from those places, and they'll have higher levels of mold toxins. And you may have an issue with the mold toxins, or even from the soybean meal that comes from biodiesel places. They actually wash that with methanol, and you might have higher levels of residual methanol in your soybean meal. So there's kind of some of those byproduct issues with that going into the cattle feed. So, I spent time on a dairy farm. May know a little of that too.
Right. So, I mean, when you talked about a bin being rejected, it made me think about earlier this year, and it's been a tricky year. Not on top of, are we late planting the crops, but we're in this trade war with China. And I think a lot of farmers across the country were holding on to their grain a little bit longer in hopes that something gets worked out that's fair for everyone. And the problem with that, and I think it's unfortunate, of course, it wasn't done intentionally to hurt farmers by any means. No one saw, really, most people didn't see this coming. Only the ones who are paying attention to grand solar minimum related topics. But earlier this year, we saw lots of flooding, heavy rains, heavy snow melt, lots of flooding, and grain bins just all it takes is one little exposed crack and just a little bit of grain pouring out of the silos, and you're thinking, well, what about the rest inside where it's dry on top? It's still contaminated, isn't it? It doesn't matter if it's just the bottom of the bin that's actually underwater. The top is no good as well.
Potentially, or they have to really go to extraordinary means to try salvage as much. They'll go in there with large vacuum devices. They'll vacuum out the dry corn. And farmers, when they know they have moldier grain, they may feed more like a dolomite lime with the feed to help buffer out the toxic chemicals. So, I mean, stuff, I'm aware of that type of thing being done with, you have moldier feed, you end up feeding dolemic lime, or lime that's basically more from the magnesium carbonate with the calcium carbonate to basically help absorb the toxins from that. But yeah, and a lot of stuff got lost. And the best thing that a person can do with that is send that off to a methane digester and make methane out of it and try to generate electricity. But not every place has that. And sometimes it just goes to pits or is left to rot. So that can occur. And it wicks right up a column of grain.
You know, this takes me to last night. I was watching a presidential rally, and I was thinking to myself, the president is signed a deal, or at least there's an agreement in place where China is going to buy lots of our agriculture. He used the number of 50 billion. And the way he described the situation was that the farmers basically telling the government, we can't produce that much, and the president's giving the farmers a pep talk, get bigger combines, get bigger tractors. But the one thing that I sat there in kind of disappointment, and again, most of his policies are helping this community as far as the regulations of CO2. He doesn't buy into that whole man-made global warming. But to me, this was the disconnect for him of the seriousness that we're looking at right now, not just here in the United States, but India's had lots of crop damage across their country. China also has experienced, I know Japan just had a pretty bad typhoon. There's crop loss involved. So there's crop loss everywhere. But what's really concerning is things like what happened in North Dakota, where a small percentage of the corn is mature and basically the grow season is over. So now you have to go out there and hope that you can harvest what little you already have for food production or whatever it is that you're growing. But to me, I hope that people really get serious about, it's not that simple just to tell the farmer to go out and get a bigger combine or a bigger tractor. It is about the cooperation of the weather right now. And again, the farmers know best. Every farmer I've ever talked about when it comes to weather, they know best. And they also, when you hear them heed warnings, I've always learned to listen too. You know, one of our, again, I have to mention Matt, you know, his father was telling him that all of his life of farming, he's never seen the conditions the way they are right now. Now, maybe 2012 was a bad year for crops too, but as far as how wet it got. And to me, and to the rest of us who follow, that makes sense when you look at the cosmic ray influx that we have in our atmosphere, where it's at near record levels, where we are seeing colder atmospheric temperatures. We are getting more moisture and precipitation, whether it's snow or rain. A lot more than we've seen the last 2 years. You have to admit, there's been an uptick in heavy flooding rains. I think Harvey and Irma were the first, whoa, this cosmic ray thing is nothing to mess with. has nothing to do with warming or CO2 or anything like that. And I just hope that we get realistic about solutions on where to grow, how to grow. I know a lot of people are saying move your garden indoors, but let's hope that we don't have to deal with an unfortunate situation, say a solar flare or something wiping out the power grid. How are you going to keep those plants lit inside a building or inside a house? Or, I mean, I have all these ideas of, we could just take abandoned warehouses and start vertical grow operations. But again, if you lose power and you have no way of lighting the plants, they won't grow. And now we're back to square one. So, I mean, I like the idea. We were talking before the show. One of the things that you were telling Mari earlier was that don't be afraid to plant more garden than you think you can handle. Would you like to elaborate on what you were trying to say to us when we were talking about that?
Right. Well, even look at my garden. It's 200 feet by 200 feet. That's just under an acre of garden. And I don't have a tractor right now to work it. I had to have a neighbor come out and work it, and then I had to actually have another neighbor come out and work it again because I didn't quite like the way it was tilled. Yeah. But I was so desperate to get my potatoes and onions in that I had these rough furrows because he used a chisel plow, and I'm just running a wheel hoe down these furrows, and I'm making them deeper so I can actually put potatoes in, or just kind of kick enough dirt over so I can do potatoes or put onions in. And I mean, I got those in before I actually got the garden disc to a spot where it was workable. But you don't know what the year is going to be like, so always overplant your garden, because big picture, you can like abandon parts of the garden. If something gets overgrown in weeds, like this year my beets and carrots, they were overgrown in all these different grasses, which are all these cryptic grain crops and other vegetables. So I'm like, well, I can't keep up with that. I'm just going to let it go. But if the year turned out like, I got let go from my job, I have extra time to put in the garden, and I have all these things started. So a lot of times we have limited time because we have family commitments, we have work commitments, we have hobbies. But if your work hours get cut back, you have a larger garden and you have more time to put in the garden. On the farm, 2013, we had a drought. I had about 200 by 200 foot garden in, but I was able to put so much extra time and effort into that garden during the drought. And because of the drought, didn't have any issues with early blights and late blights. It was very productive, and I had a very nice deer fence around it, which I never had with green beans, and I never knew how productive green beans actually were. And we have vegetables that we are still eating 6 years out. And I think going into these times where you're going to have growing seasons that may not turn out, growing enough food that you can actually be eating it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 plus years out from the time you grew it is going to be important. So don't just grow enough vegetables for yourself for the year. Grow as much as you can handle if you only had time to put in the garden. And think about ways that you can save time. I do a lot of things with mulching. So I like biodegradable plastic mulch because it's a pain in the butt to go and pull out the mulch when you're done with it. And this stuff, you just disc it in and it breaks down the soil. I've also, I like using cardboard and straw. So I will do a layer of cardboard, put straw over the top, and I will plant my bedding plants into there. I've done over 100 tomatoes planted in cardboard and straw and spacing them all 4 feet away from each other. Kind of in a hexagonal design. And I've had very good results with that because the big thing with mulching, you keep the soil from splashing up on the leaves, and that's where a lot of your disease organisms are. And especially during colder, wet growing seasons that we have a greater potential of encountering in the coming years. Mulching the soil, keeping it from splashing up on your plants will protect you from a lot of diseases. And I like using those type of methods, and then I'll put a row crop between my two mulch rolls. So I'll have like rows of tomatoes and cabbages, and I'll have a row of beans down the middle, and the beans will fill in. They also they will sequester nitrogen in the rhizomes down there, and it kind of helps feed the garden with feeding yourself. And so, Jake, Mari, do you guys garden yourselves, or do you have any pots or growing boxes?
Well, this year, Mari was going to start a project with the children, and she bought the soil, she bought the seeds, and the scary part is we couldn't get anything started. And so we were doing it in Buffalo a little bit and somewhat favorable conditions, but this year was kind of, maybe we were doing something wrong.
Well, I had a beautiful garden
I don't know,
in Buffalo.
But I felt like with the conditions that we had this spring, how cold it was, how much rain we got, and also DIY homestead, yes, solar power is going to be helpful in the future. And I agree that we could definitely attempt to do solar powered indoor growing. But my concern is TSI continues to drop. And guys, with cosmic rays being so high, more cloud nucleation, thicker, denser clouds, it's blocking more TSI. And I was talking to Lee Wheelbarger, who has a solar powered yacht. And he was actually in DC when Tropical Storm Melissa had formed, and the cloud coverage was so thick that his yacht, what usually produced power within several hours, would be almost fully charged in a short period of time. He was only gaining maybe 10, 15, 20% charge when he's usually at a full charge. So that's where my concern with solar power comes in the future, is where if the continuation of cosmic rays continues to go up and cloud nucleation and more cloud coverage happens, are we going to get enough solar energy to power up an indoor grow operation? And then the next scary part too is, you were asking us if we had a garden, are we going to be able to grow out here in New York? And this might be the first indication of a wake-up call if we have this problem next spring as well.
And when we look at things that way, how much southern facing glass do you have in your house? Do you have large bay windows to the south? Could you put extra windows facing south in your house? Can you grow vegetables with all your southern facing windows? I've actually seen where one fellow took an old trailer house and he gutted it basically and put large windows all across the southern side of the old trailer house to grow plants inside the trailer. So he made a very inexpensive sheltered greenhouse out of a trailer, and didn't take too much to heat it.
Well, and so, I'm glad you mentioned that, because there's another gentleman I'd like to bring on and talk about. This guy really living off the land, but he has an 8-sided home, 8 walls that have windows in each of them, and a black granite floor. So he opens the curtains to allow the sunlight to heat up the floor. And he said there's times where he has to shut some of the curtains to kind of keep the heat down, because it gets really hot inside that building. He's got R40 insulation, so that probably helps as well. But still, interesting that you mentioned that as well. There is still ways we can use solar energy, but again, if we're having problems now, I'm going to really pay attention next year. And maybe Mari and I will try also a raised garden next year, like give it a whirl. We have property we can go plant at least. So, but the other thing too, we live around a lot of trees. So that's another obstacle. We don't get the sunlight. I mean, that's the blessing in the summertime, is that the house stayed pretty cool for the most part. So we don't have the sunlight at either properties actually.
Well, I mean, the trees actually provide an opportunity too, because figure the trees. Which trees do you love? Which ones are functional for keeping your house cool? Which ones can you part with to open up an area of sunlight? And there's people that will take the branches of the trees and bury them in the dirt, make these mounds called hugas. And you can use the slow breakdown of the trees as a way of fertilizing these mounds for growing vegetables in.
Did not know that.
Mm-hmm. It's a permaculture technique. So, and then if you cut down a tree, say you take this maple out, you will have, it's called copacing, because you'll have all these branches growing up from the stump, and you can let them grow up to be about 4 inches around, and at that width, you can use them for firewood, or you cut them in the winter time, and you can use them. Does nothing for you, Jake, but you can use them for raising mushrooms in.
Again,
I love mushrooms.
I'll tell you what. As long as I can get some hot oil in the shift, and burn it over the fire and deep fry those bad boys, I give them a shot.
Let's practice.
No, deep fat frying makes a lot of things good. So I will never fault a person who wants to deep fry.
Good. That's about the only way I think I'm going to be able to do it.
Well, like another thing, if you don't have the soil, places to go and get information. I like going to the library and checking out books a number of times before I go and buy them. But you can try straw bale gardening if you don't have the beds already. And you actually don't need to buy straw bales themselves. You can use the organic matter around your place. You can use the dry grasses, plants, and leaves and bundle them up. And like the Straw Bale Gardener Complete has techniques for building with a tote and some wood, after making your own bales. And then basically make a bale of compost and you plant into this bale of compost. And a technique like that is good for people that don't have good soil or need something where they can have it raised. And people do this where they plant the straw bales on sheets of plastic, and then they dig a hole down, put a bucket in there, and they get the water that drains off the straw bales, and they re-irrigate the bales with the water from the bucket. So straw bale gardening is a technique where if you don't have good soil, you can build up a lot of, basically you're growing in compost, you don't need to use the soil in your place. So, and then you can make it so you can move it around. So you have them on plastic where you can slide them, or you have them in carts or boxes. You can move them in a garage if you have a hailstorm coming and protect your plants from the weather by making them mobile. Like even the new Square Foot Gardening book, basically they use a 6-inch topsoil method where they have their blend of organic matter, I think it's peat, and I'll have to look at it again, but 6 inches of that, you could have it on a raised cart, and when the weather gets bad, like a hailstorm or thunderstorm that might destroy your plants, you wheel it inside a garage or another building to keep it out of the bad weather. I think techniques like having beds where you can move your stuff inside if the weather gets to the point where it would damage it is a way of getting around having an indoor growing facility. There was a fellow down, I believe it's Iowa. No, it's southern Minnesota. He took those large fuel tanks, or those fuel oil tanks that people used to have in their basements. He would cut them in half, clean them out, and he used those for planters of fruit trees. And in the wintertime, he would take these giant planters with his tractor into his barn. And he was able to grow like zone 6 and 7 fruit trees in Minnesota, but he would just overwinter them inside of barns so they did not get as cold in the winter. So even the concept of making larger movable planters is something that can allow us to work around the days that would kill off our gardens.
Well, Jesse, we're about out of time tonight on our YouTube channel, but we really need to do this again because I think tonight was just kind of the tip of the iceberg, and I say that to some of our listeners when you call in as well, but we really appreciate you spending some time with us tonight. We'd like to do a follow-up here in a few weeks and maybe talk about the current conditions of crops, and maybe over that period of time in a back and forth we can kind of brainstorm and pick a few topics to just kind of focus on. But I mean, there is so much that you threw at us tonight, with recipes on how to eat the weeds in your garden, to ideas of putting these gardens on things that you could slide into a shelter quickly and easily during a major storm, or if you know one's coming. And again, nobody knows the weather better than an old school farmer. So again, you guys are pretty, you know the signs to look for when it's time to move certain plants indoors, is what I'm kind of trying to say. So, but Jesse, thank you again for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you having on the program.
Oh, happy to be here. And thing I will say is, everybody try to get out there and grow more. Don't be afraid to buy more seeds than buy an ounce of seed, buy a pound of seed. If you've never bought an ounce or a pound of seed of something that you like, go out there and try to buy more seed than you've ever bought before, because just fall in love with the seeds, and it's a great start. And don't be afraid to go and ask your neighbors for the leaves right now, because that's a lot of free growing material that's out on the edges of the roads.
And definitely some good tips there, Jesse. Thank you once again. We will do this soon, and tomorrow night is our call-in show on the Patreon. So if you got nothing to do, say hello tomorrow night. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear from you again.
Yeah, I would be happy to call in, and it's amazing how fast the hour went. I feel like we barely brushed the surface.
We haven't even begun. So this is I'm eager to have these conversations every couple of weeks or so, just to kind of get an idea and pick your brain. And that way we can kind of get ourselves ready for next year. Hopefully we get a grow season better than this year. But again, we'll have to wait and see. It's not looking promising, but we'll have to wait and see nonetheless. But Jesse, thank you once again for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, Jesse. All right, guys. So definitely very useful conversation. The guy his family has been in farming all his life, dairy farmers to be exact. Unfortunately, his family had to sell off the dairy part of their farming, as a lot of dairy farmers are being lost across the United States. But these are some of the things that we would want to start bringing you guys, not just your news on climate and policies and space weather, but we definitely got to kick it into high gear and start coming up with some solutions. Sam, I saw you in the chat earlier, and the comment you made was, so really nothing might work when it comes to growing. Well, we certainly hope it doesn't come to that, but we need to prepare for the worst and try to come up with solutions so that doesn't happen. But like I was saying to Jesse, and Mari, I think you'll agree, I think this spring when we try to plant again, we're going to have a couple of different options. I think we should try the garden thing, and then do exactly what you did this year. And if we don't have any luck, then
No, the biggest mistake I made was not starting everything indoors weeks prior. I just anticipated that the weather would...
Good point, but do you think it would even survive, though, with all the rain and the cool temperatures we had?
No, because the plants I did have for a while, they either had bug infestations or some kind of weird fungal disease or blight. Like, it was just an epic
fail. Fungal disease thing really kind of ran rapid this year, and that's due to the moisture. But poor Mari, unfortunately, is suffering once again from some kind of respiratory cold. So we'll hope you feel better over there.
It's me and the kids playing ping pong.
Yeah, pretty much. Thank you, public schools.
But I was discussing with some people in the chat in our morning broadcast that I might have a vitamin D deficiency. I keep getting sick all the time, so I'm going to get a vitamin D supplement and see how that goes.
Jake Ryder mentioned in the chat, it's great to know how to have your own honeybees. I can't agree with that 120,000% with you. I absolutely. The problem is that we don't have a lot of people out there that know how to raise bees and don't understand that. I'm fascinated with it. And it's funny that you mentioned it, because I catch myself watching a professional beekeeper come in and remove hives and find the queens and place her in different hives. And it's fascinating how much some of these bee experts actually know about the colony and the queen. And so it is very important. There are other pollinators, so we do need more people to step up and learn things like this. And I know a few people that have the knowledge, and that's impressive. That is very useful. So it is fortunate to have those skills. All right, guys, we're going to wrap it up for tonight. We are doing the Patreon show. Was that 9 p.m. or 8 p.m. tomorrow? What was that?
Pick one.
Let's do 9.
9.
We'll do
I think
9.
the turnout is a little bit better at 9 because people have come accustomed to tuning into a 9 o'clock show.
So let's do 9 p.m. on the Patreon channel. Those of you who are not members of Patreon on Grand Solar Minimum, guys, it's only $1. $1 gets you in on the call-in show. You'll get the phone number to call in and discuss whatever you want, really. Last week we talked about survival skills, prepping skills, stuff like that. We'll probably dive in a little bit more of the article that Mario wrote about prepping and all that good stuff. There was lots of stuff to share that night. So looking forward to talking to you folks tomorrow night. Those of you who aren't Patreon members, again, just $1 gets you in the show. Till tomorrow night, guys. I hope everyone has a great evening. We will talk soon. Take care, guys.
Do you like this show? Give us a thumbs up. Want to support us more? Share to your favorite social platform. Buy a t-shirt or become a Patreon. All links are in the description below.